The sun had not yet fully risen over the Clearwaters Mountains when Mr. John Rivers was already up, observing the contours of the mountains he knew so well through the window of his modest house. His eyes, marked by time, scanned every detail of the landscape, while his calloused hands automatically prepared the strong coffee that had accompanied him every morning for more than 5 decades. The smoke rising from the cup seemed to dance with the first rays of sunlight penetrating the kitchen window, creating a private spectacle that only he witnessed. The familiar aroma of coffee mingled with the smell of damp earth coming from outside, announcing another day of work in timber harvesting. Rockville was still asleep when Mr. John began organizing his tools. The axe, an inheritance from his father, rested in the corner of the room along with the ropes and other implements necessary for his trade. Each instrument carried stories, memories of days of hard work and knowledge passed down from generation to generation. It was October, and the morning air carried that peculiar mixture of cold and heat that preceded summer. The leaves of the trees danced gently with the morning breeze, creating shadows that moved like ghosts across the dirt ground. Mr. John knew every sign that nature offered, every subtle change in the wind that could indicate changes in the weather. As he packed his backpack with lunch prepared the night before, his thoughts wandered to the special request he had received from Father Michael. The town church needed new wood for the altar renovation, and not just any log would do. It needed to be quality wood, strong enough to support the weight of the saints and durable enough to last for generations. As he left the house, the old logger noticed something different in the air. It wasn't just the unusual silence of the morning or the absence of the birdsong that normally accompanied him. It was something deeper, more subtle, as if the mountain itself was whispering warnings that he couldn't yet fully comprehend. Crossing the narrow streets of the town, Mr. John encountered few residents awake. Those who were, as always, greeted him with respect. After all, he was more than a simple logger. He was a guardian of local traditions, a man who carried within him the wisdom of the mountains. It was when he passed by Mrs. Rose's house that he felt a shiver run down his spine. The old healer, known for her connection to the mysteries of the mountain, was sitting in her rocking chair, observing him with a penetrating gaze that seemed to pierce his soul. Her eyes, deep as wells, conveyed a silent message that he couldn't decipher. "Be careful, Mr. John," she said, her hoarse voice cutting through the morning silence. "The mountain has its own eyes. It knows who respects it and who defies it." The logger nodded respectfully but didn't stop. Years of experience had taught him to respect local superstitions, even if he didn't fully believe in them. However, Mrs. Rose's words echoed in his mind as he approached the trail that would lead him to his worksite. The path was familiar, but that morning it seemed different. The shadows cast by the trees formed strange patterns on the ground, and the silence was so dense it was disturbing. Not even the rustling of leaves seemed natural. It was as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for something that was about to happen. Mr. John adjusted the weight of the tools on his back and continued climbing the trail, ignoring the growing feeling of unease settling in his chest. After all, he had a job to do, and years of experience had taught him that the mountain, as mysterious as it was, had always been fair to those who treated it with respect. The sun was already high when Mr. John arrived at the site where he intended to work. The light filtered through the treetops, created a mosaic of light and shadow on the forest floor, revealing the dance of dust particles in the air. The logger set his tools on the ground and began to assess the trunks around him, looking for the one that would be perfect for the church altar. His experienced eyes soon identified a majestic golden oak that stood out among the other trees. The trunk was robust, perfectly aligned, and its age seemed suitable for the work that needed to be done. Mr. John circled the tree several times, analyzing every detail, every mark on its bark, like a doctor examining a patient. As he made his observations, a sudden and unexpected wind stirred the treetops. The sound produced by the leaves was different from usual, almost like a distant lament. Mr. John paused for a moment, paying attention to the signs of nature, as his father had taught him so many years ago. There was something in the air, a different energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. Mrs. Rose's words came back to his mind. "The mountain has its own eyes." He shook his head, trying to push those thoughts away. It wasn't time for superstitions. He had an important job to do, and time was passing. He picked up his axe, feeling the familiar weight of the wooden handle in his hands, and positioned himself to begin cutting. The first blow echoed through the forest like distant thunder. The silence that followed seemed even deeper, as if the entire forest had held its breath. Mr. John continued his work with the precision that years of experience had given him, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Suddenly, a peculiar sound caught his attention. It was like the beating of hooves against the ground, but different from any animal he had ever heard in the region. The sound seemed to come from all directions at once, as if he was being surrounded by an invisible herd. He stopped again, leaning on his axe, and scrutinized the forest around him. The shadows between the trees seemed denser now, moving in a way that couldn't be explained just by the swaying of branches in the wind. For a moment, he thought he saw bright eyes watching him from within the darkness, but when he blinked, the vision had disappeared. "It's just imagination playing tricks," he muttered to himself, trying to focus again on the work. But the beating of hooves continued, now closer, more distinct. The wind increased in intensity, and the dry leaves on the forest floor began to swirl in small whirlwinds. The golden oak was almost cut, needing only a few more precise blows to complete the job. Mr. John mentally calculated the direction of the fall, as he always did. Years of experience had taught him to predict exactly where the tree would fall, but something inside him screamed that today was different. That's when he heard a neigh. Not a common neigh, but a deep and ancestral sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. The sound reverberated throughout the mountain, making the leaves tremble and birds take flight in panic. Mr. John felt a chill run down his spine as his hands gripped the axe handle more tightly. Time seemed to slow down as he delivered the final blow. The wood cracked in a way he had never heard before, a sharp and unnatural sound that cut through the air like a scream. In the next moment, he realized something was terribly wrong. The trunk wasn't falling in the direction he had predicted. A matter of seconds, which seemed to stretch for an eternity, Mr. John tried to move, but his feet seemed stuck to the ground. The world around him spun in slow motion as the immense trunk descended towards him. The last thought he had before the impact was that perhaps he should have paid more attention to Mrs. Rose's warnings. Pain exploded like lightning throughout Mr. John's body. The crushing weight of the trunk on his right leg kept him pinned to the forest floor like an insect in a web. The impact had been so violent that for a few seconds he was dazed, his vision darkening at the edges as he tried to process what had happened. When his mind began to clear, the first thing he noticed was the silence. A silence different from anything he had ever experienced in his decades of work in the mountains. It wasn't the natural silence of the forest, the one punctuated by the distant song of birds or the rustling of leaves. It was a dense silence, almost palpable, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Help!" he shouted, his hoarse voice echoing among the trees. But he knew it was useless. He was alone in that part of the mountain, too far from town for anyone to hear him. The sun, which had been high in the sky before, now began its lazy descent towards the horizon, painting the clouds with orange hues that heralded twilight. He tried to move, but each movement sent waves of sharp pain through his leg. Sweat ran down his face, mixing with dust and falling into his eyes. With trembling hands he felt around, looking for something he could use as a lever to try to free himself, but his tools had been thrown far away during the tree's fall. Minutes dragged on like hours. The temperature began to drop, characteristic of nights in the mountains, and Mr. John felt an involuntary shiver run through his body. It wasn't just the physical cold that bothered him, but a cold sensation that seemed to come from within, from the depths of his soul. For the first time in many years he felt afraid. As he lay there, helpless, his mind wandered to the stories his grandfather used to tell, stories about the mountain and its mysteries, about how it protected those who respected it and punished those who defied it. "But I always respected it," he murmured to himself, his voice trembling slightly. "I always did everything the right way." The sky above the treetops began to darken, and with night approaching, new sounds emerged from the forest. Sounds that, even after so many years of experience, he had never heard before. They were different from the usual nighttime noises of the forest. There was something more to them, something that made his heart beat faster. It was then that he noticed a change in the environment. The air seemed to become denser, charged with a strange energy that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. The shadows between the trees seemed to move independently, as if they had a life of their own. And that sound of hooves he had heard before the accident, was back. Mr. John tried to force his eyes in the growing twilight, searching for the source of the sound. The noise approached, rhythmic and constant, as if some animal was circling around, him observing him. But it was different from any animal he knew. There was a cadence to the sound, an intentionality that didn't belong to a common beast. The wind blew stronger between the trees, bringing with it a peculiar smell, a mixture of damp earth with something older, wilder. The dry leaves on the forest floor began to move in small whirlwinds, dancing around his immobilized body as if following a silent music. Mr. John felt his throat go dry. Years of experience in the mountains had taught him to trust his instincts, and now they were all screaming that something extraordinary was about to happen. Mrs. Rose's words echoed in his mind with frightening clarity. The mountain has its own eyes. The sound of hooves got closer, more defined. Now he could feel the vibration in the ground reverberating through the earth to his trapped body. His heart was beating so hard it seemed to want to jump out of his chest. The darkness between the trees seemed to thicken, to concentrate, taking on a form that his eyes struggled to comprehend. And then, emerging from the shadows as if it were part of them, he saw it. A Mustang horse with a chestnut coat, so bright it seemed to capture the last rays of the setting sun. But it wasn't a common horse. There was something in its eyes, something deep and ancestral, that made Mr. John hold his breath. The animal stopped a few meters away, its presence filling the clearing with an aura of power that was almost tangible. The Mustang remained motionless, its eyes fixed on Mr. John with an intensity that defied any natural explanation. The logger, even in his state of pain and exhaustion, couldn't look away from that majestic creature. There was something hypnotic about its presence, something that transcended common understanding of the world. The animal's coat had a supernatural glow, as if each hair was woven with threads of twilight light. Its nostrils dilated rhythmically, absorbing the night air that was approaching, and its mane undulated in the wind as if it had a life of its own. But it was its eyes that were most impressive, deep, dark, and infinitely wise, as if they held the oldest secrets of the mountain. For a moment that seemed to stretch for eternity, man and animal studied each other mutually. Mr. John, despite the searing pain in his leg, felt a strange calm take over his being. It was as if he was in front of something much greater than a simple wild horse, something that belonged to the ancient legends that his grandfather used to tell on winter nights. The Mustang took a step forward, its hooves touching the ground. With an impossible delicacy for an animal of its size, there was no fear in its movements, nor the natural caution that wild animals usually show in front of humans. There was purpose in each step, as if it knew exactly what it needed to do. As it approached the fallen trunk, the horse lowered its imposing head and began to sniff the air around Mr. John's trapped leg. Its warm muzzle lightly brushed the logger's skin, causing a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold of the approaching night. Then, to the old man's complete astonishment, the animal began to dig the ground around the trunk with its front hooves. The earth flew to the sides as the horse worked with almost surgical precision. Its movements were calculated, methodical, as if it was following a previously established plan. The sound of its hooves against the ground echoed through the silent forest, mixing with the rustling of leaves in the trees above. "My God in heaven," muttered Mr. John, watching in disbelief as the animal continued its tireless work. The pain in his leg had transformed into a constant throbbing, but now his mind was completely focused on the surreal spectacle unfolding before his eyes. After creating considerable space around the trunk, the Mustang changed position. With a fluid movement that seemed to defy the laws of physics, it positioned itself beside the fallen tree and began to push it with its robust body. its muscles tensed under the shining coat, evidencing the extraordinary strength it was applying. Against the wood, the trunk began to move, first just a few millimeters, then entire centimeters. Each movement was accompanied by a creak of the wood and a sigh of relief from Mr. John, who felt the pressure on his leg gradually decrease. The EU horse worked with an unwavering determination, as if it perfectly understood the urgency of the situation. Finally, after a last effort that made the animal let out a deep and reverberating neigh, the trunk moved enough for Mr. John to free his leg. The relief was immediate, although the pain still persisted. The logger dragged himself away from the fallen tree, his hands trembling as he examined the damage to his leg. The Mustang approached again, this time positioning itself beside Mr. John in a way that made its intention clear. It lowered its head slightly and, with gentleness, pulled the sleeve of the logger's shirt with its teeth. The message was as clear as water. It was offering help. Mr. John hesitated for only a moment. The situation was so extraordinary that it bordered on the absurd, but something in his heart told him he could trust this mysterious creature. With considerable effort and leaning on the animal's silky mane, he managed to hoist himself onto its back. The horse remained perfectly still throughout the process, as if it understood the difficulty of the injured man. Night was beginning to fall over the Clearwater's mountains when the Mustang began its descent down the winding trails. Mr. John, clinging to the animal's silky mane, alternated between moments of lucidity and confusion, while the pain in his leg pulsed to the rhythm of hooves against the ground. What impressed the old logger most was the way the animal moved. Even in the growing darkness, the Mustang seemed to know every stone, every root, and every curve of the path. Its steps were sure and precise, as if it were following an invisible map etched in its ancestral memory. The shadows of the night danced around them, and the sounds of the forest seemed different now. The wind whispered among the leaves of the trees, creating a strange melody that reminded of an ancient lullaby. From time to time, a distant hoot of an owl cut through the air, as if announcing the passage of this unusual pair. "How do you know where to go?" muttered Mr. John, more to himself than to the animal. To his surprise, the horse responded with a slight head movement, as if it understood the question. Its ears moved constantly, capturing sounds that human senses couldn't perceive. The moon began to rise in the sky, pouring its silver light through the treetops. Its glow seemed to concentrate in a special way on the Mustang's coat, making it shine as if it were made of fallen stars. It was a vision that Mr. John knew he would never forget, even if he lived 100 years. At a certain point in the journey, they passed through an ancient clearing that the logger knew well. It was a place where, according to the stories of the elders, mysterious encounters took place between the first inhabitants of the region and the entities of the forest. His grandfather used to say that there, on full moon nights, it was possible to hear music that no human instrument could produce. The horse stopped briefly in this place, its nostrils dilating as it absorbed the night air. Mr. John felt a shiver run down his spine when he noticed that small points of light, similar to fireflies, began to appear around them. But they were different from any firefly he had ever seen. Their light was more intense, more lasting, and they seemed to dance in patterns that defied chance. "You're one of them, aren't you?" whispered the logger, his voice choked with emotion. "And fatigue. One of the mountain guardians my grandfather talked about." The Mustang turned its head slightly, its deep eyes meeting Mr. John's. In that moment they were no longer an injured man and a wild animal, but two creatures united by something much older and more sacred than words could express. The journey continued, and Mr. John realized they were beginning to approach the outskirts of the town. The distant lights of the first houses of Rockville began to dot the darkness like earthly stars. The air subtly changed, bringing with it the familiar smells of wood burning in stoves and dew beginning to form on the plants in the yards. But before they reached the first buildings, the horse took a different path, an almost invisible trail that skirted the town. Mr. John recognized the route. It was an old path used by drovers, now almost forgotten by younger residents. This detour would lead them directly to Mrs. Rose's house. The wisdom of the animal in choosing this path didn't go unnoticed by the logger. After all, who better to receive an injured man brought by a mystical being of the forest than the old healer? Mrs. Rose always said there were more mysteries in the mountain than stars in the sky, and now Mr. John fully understood the meaning of those words. The Mustang's trot gradually slowed, becoming gentler as they approached the healer's house. The shadows seemed denser in that part of the town, as if they were protecting something that ordinary eyes shouldn't see. The silence was broken only by the rhythmic sound of the animal's hooves and Mr. John's heavy breathing. Mrs. Rose's house stood out in the twilight like a beacon of mysteries. A single lamp lit on the porch created dancing shadows on the adobe walls, and the aroma of dried herbs hung in the air like an invisible mist. To Mr. John's surprise, the old healer was already waiting for him, sitting in her rocking chair as if she knew exactly when they would arrive. The Mustang stopped gently in front of the house, its posture still majestic despite the long journey. Mrs. Rose rose slowly, her eyes shining in a peculiar way in the lamplight. She showed no surprise at all to see the injured logger mounted on a wild horse. It was as if she had been expecting this scene for a long time. "You've finally met one of the guardians, John," she said, her hoarse voice carrying a tone of reverence. "The mountain chose well the moment to reveal itself to you." With the help of the healer and her grandson Peter, who appeared silently from the shadows of the house, Mr. John managed to dismount. His legs trembled, both from pain and exhaustion, but his eyes didn't leave the Mustang. The animal remained where it was, its deep eyes reflecting the lamplight as if they held the brilliance of 1,000 stars. Inside the house, while Mrs. Rose prepared her ointments and herbs to treat the injured leg, Mr. John couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The strong smell of medicinal herbs mingled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that Peter was preparing, creating an atmosphere that seemed suspended between the common world and something older and more mysterious. "You always knew, didn't you, Mrs. Rose?" he finally asked as the healer applied an herbal paste to his leg. "About the mountain guardians?" The old lady smiled, her wrinkled hands moving with the precision of decades of practice. "The mountain is more alive than most people imagine, John. It has its own guardians, its own ways of protecting those who respect it. That horse, it's not a common animal, as you must have realized." Mr. John nodded, remembering the supernatural intelligence in the Mustang's eyes, the way it had worked methodically to free him from the fallen trunk. But why now? Why me? The old stories say that the guardians only reveal themselves in moments of great need, and only to those who carry the mountain in their heart, replied Mrs. Rose, tying a cloth soaked in herbs around the logger's leg. "You've spent your whole life respecting the forest, John. You learned its ways, listened to its signs. Today, when you needed it, the mountain returned that respect." Peter returned with 3 cups of coffee, and through the open window they could see the Mustang still standing in the same place, its silhouette outlined against the starry sky. The animal looked like a living statue, an ancestral guardian materialized in the world of men. "But tomorrow when I tell this story," Mr. John began, his voice hesitant. "Some will doubt," Mrs. Rose completed, an enigmatic smile on her lips. "There are always those who need to see to believe. But the wisest, those who still keep the old stories in their hearts, they will understand. The mountain has always had its mysteries, John. Some of them only reveal themselves to those who are ready to see them." The silence that followed was deep and meaningful, broken only by the occasional soft neigh of the horse outside. The night was advancing, and with it Mr. John felt that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of the world. The mountain he had known since childhood, which he thought he knew so well, had revealed itself to be much more mysterious and sacred than he had ever imagined. "And now?" he asked, his eyes turning to the window, where he could see the Mustang's silhouette against the starry sky. "Now you carry a secret of the mountain," replied Mrs. Rose, her voice taking on a more solemn tone. "A reminder that there are more mysteries in these valleys and mountains than our eyes can see, and perhaps when another needs it, it will be your turn to share this story, to keep alive the memory of the guardians." The news of Mr. John's accident spread through Rockville like wind through the leaves. The next morning, while the sun still struggled to overcome the mist that covered the mountain, there was already a small gathering of people on Mrs. Rose's porch, all anxious to know how the old logger was doing. Seated in a straw chair with his leg carefully bandaged with the healer's herbs, Mr. John observed the movement with a mixture of gratitude and unease. Each person who arrived brought not only words of comfort but also questions, many questions, about how he had managed to return to town. "It was a wild horse that brought me," he would reply, carefully choosing his words. Something inside him knew that not everyone was ready to hear the full story, to understand the true nature of his savior. The skeptical looks of some and the condescending smiles of others confirmed his intuition. Father Michael, who had arrived early to see how the logger was doing, listened to everything with special attention. His eyes shone in a peculiar way when Mr. John mentioned certain details of the previous night, as if he recognized something between the lines of the story. "The mountain has its own ways of taking care of its own," the priest said at one point, exchanging a meaningful look with Mrs. Rose. "Not everything needs to be explained to be true." The religious man's words provoked different reactions among those present. Some agreed with solemn gestures, especially the older ones, who had grown up hearing the old stories about the mysteries of the Clearwater's mountains. Others, mainly the younger ones, exchanged disbelieving smiles, attributing everything to chance or the imagination of an injured and frightened man. Mary Wilson, the teacher at the town's only school, approached Mr. John with a special gleam in her eye. "My grandfather used to tell stories about mysterious horses in the mountain," she said, her voice low and respectful. "He said they were guardians, ancient spirits that protected the forest and those who respected it." The old logger felt a chill hearing those words. He remembered the deep eyes of the mustang, the way it had worked methodically to free him, the supernatural intelligence it had demonstrated throughout the journey. It wasn't just a wild horse, it was something more, something that human words could barely describe. Throughout the day, as people came and went, Mr. John realized that his experience had created a kind of invisible division in the town. On one side were those who, like Mary Wilson and Father Michael, could see beyond the veil of the everyday, who understood that there were mysteries greater than human reason. On the other, those who needed logical explanations for everything, who preferred to believe that he had simply found a tame horse that, by coincidence, had helped him. Mrs. Rose observed everything with her enigmatic smile, intervening only occasionally to drive away the more insistent curious or to renew the herbal dressings on the logger's leg. Her eyes, however, frequently turned to the mountain, as if she expected or knew something that others couldn't see. At the end of the afternoon, when most of the visitors had already left, Mr. John finally got a moment of silence to reflect. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the mustang's shining coat. It was then that he noticed something curious. Near Mrs. Rose's house, where the horse had remained the night before, there wasn't a single hoof print on the ground. "The footprints of the guardians only remain in the hearts of those who know how to see," said the healer, as if reading his thoughts. She approached with a new cup of herbal tea, her wrinkled face softened by the twilight light. "Some mysteries of the mountain are not made to leave marks in the physical world, John. They exist to mark our soul." In the week that followed the incident, as his leg recovered under Mrs. Rose's care, Mr. John began to notice subtle changes in his way of seeing the world. It was as if the encounter with the mustang had removed a veil from his eyes, allowing him to see layers of reality that had always been there, but that he had never noticed before. The sounds of the mountain reached his ears differently now. The birdsong seemed to carry messages that he could almost understand, and the wind among the trees sounded like an ancient, half-forgotten song. Even from afar, observing the mountains through the window of the healer's house, he could feel a vital pulse emanating from the forest, as if the entire mountain was a single living and conscious being. "This is how it begins," Mrs. Rose said, one afternoon as she changed the dressings on his leg. "First the senses open, then comes understanding." The old healer seemed younger when she talked about the mysteries of the mountain, as if the ancient knowledge she carried filled her with a special energy. It was on one of these afternoons that she finally decided to share with Mr. John a story she had kept for decades. Seated in her rocking chair with a cup of herbal tea in her hands, she began to speak in a voice that seemed to come from far away in time. "When I was a girl," she said, "my grandmother told me about the first inhabitants of these lands. They didn't see the mountain just as a place, but as a living force, an ancient entity that chose its own guardians. The Mustang that saved you, John, is just one of them. There are others, each with its own form and purpose." Mr. John listened attentively, feeling that each word from the healer helped explain things he had experienced throughout his life in the mountain, small mysterious events that he had never been able to fully understand. "The ancients said that these guardians only reveal themselves at special moments," Mrs. Rose continued, her eyes fixed on the mountains visible through the window, "sometimes to save someone in danger, other times to convey an important warning, but always there is a greater purpose behind each appearance." It was then that the healer shared something that made Mr. John's heart race. "Your story with the guardian didn't end that night, John. The fact that it revealed itself to you means that you too have been chosen. The mountain is calling you for something greater." At that moment, as if to confirm Mrs. Rose's words, a sudden wind entered through the window, making the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling dance and filling the air with their mysterious aromas. In the distance, a neigh echoed among the mountains, so distant that it could have been just imagination. "But chosen for what?" asked Mr. John, his voice barely hiding the mixture of anxiety and curiosity he felt. "That," replied the healer, with an enigmatic smile, "is something you'll need to discover for yourself. But I can tell you one thing, when a guardian chooses someone, it's because great changes are coming. The mountain is restless, John. It feels things that we, with our limited vision, still cannot see." Mrs. Rose's words hung in the air like clouds before a storm. Mr. John looked at his bandaged leg, then at the mountains stretching to the horizon. For the first time, he realized that his life as a logger might have a greater purpose than simply extracting wood from the forest. "And the others?" he asked after a long silence. "Are there other people in town who have seen the guardians?" The old healer slowly rose from her chair and walked to an ancient carved wooden chest that stood in a corner of the room. With deliberate movements, she opened the lid and removed an object wrapped in a faded cloth. With reverent care, Mrs. Rose unwrapped the faded cloth, revealing an ancient leather-bound diary. The yellowed pages and worn cover told stories even before they were opened. The smell of old paper and ink mingled with the aroma of herbs that permeated the healer's house. "This diary," she said, caressing the cover with trembling fingers, "belonged to my great-grandmother, Clara Sanders. She too was chosen by the mountain guardians almost 100 years ago." With delicacy, she opened the book to a page marked with a faded red ribbon. Mr. John leaned forward in his chair, ignoring the pain in his leg. The diary's pages were filled with elegant and precise handwriting, interspersed with detailed drawings of plants, animals, and mysterious symbols. But what caught his attention most were the sketches of a Mustang identical to the one that had saved him. "My great-grandmother was known as the Guardian of Stories," Mrs. Rose continued, her voice laden with emotion. "She recorded in this diary not only her own encounters with the mysteries of the mountain, but also the ancient stories that the first inhabitants shared with her." Carefully turning the pages, the healer showed Mr. John records of other encounters with the mountain guardians. There were accounts of a mountain lion that guided lost travelers back to safety, of a hawk that warned of impending storms, and of a serpent that indicated where to find rare medicinal herbs. "But the Mustang," she explained, pausing on a specific page, "that one is special. It's the oldest of the guardians, the first to establish a pact with the mountain people. When it chooses to reveal itself to someone, it's because great changes are coming." Mr. John absorbed every word, every detail of the drawings in the diary. One passage in particular caught his attention. "The equine guardian appears when the mountain needs new protectors. It chooses those who have hearts open to the mysteries and the courage to defend what is sacred." "But defend against what?" asked Mr. John, his voice barely disguising his concern. "Is the mountain in danger?" Mrs. Rose slowly closed the diary, her eyes distant, as if seeing beyond the walls of her house. The mountain has always been in danger, John, since the first man discovered he could fell trees and excavate mountains. But now it's different. Rising with difficulty, the healer walked to the window. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with shades of orange and purple that made the mountains seem to be on fire. Have you noticed how the silence is different? How the birds sing with more urgency? The mountain is trying to tell us something, and few still know how to listen. Suddenly, a strong wind blew through the open window, making the pages of the diary flutter and the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling dance frantically. The air became charged with an intense aroma of damp earth and wildflowers, even though it hadn't rained. That's why the Guardian chose you, John, Mrs. Rose continued, turning to face him. You know the mountain like few do. You know its paths, its secrets. More importantly, you respect it. Now it needs you for something greater than simply extracting its timber. The old healer sat down again, placing the diary in Mr. John's lap. This knowledge now belongs to you too. The stories need to stay alive, passing from guardian to guardian, just as the mountain itself stays alive through generations. The logger looked at the diary in his hands, feeling the weight of decades of history and knowledge. The last lights of day entered through the window, making the yellowed pages shine like old gold. It was then that he noticed something curious. On the last page of the diary, there was a hand-drawn map showing trails and landmarks of the mountain that he had never seen before. That, said Mrs. Rose, noticing his interest in the map, is the path to the heart of the mountain. The place where the guardians gather when great decisions need to be made, and that's where you'll need to go when your leg is healed. The weeks passed, and with them, Mr. John's leg healed under Mrs. Rose's attentive care. During this time, the old logger immersed himself in the pages of Clara Sanders' diary, absorbing every story, every detail of the encounters with the mountain guardians. At night, in his dreams, he saw himself riding the mysterious Mustang along trails he had never known in his decades of work in the forest. The map on the last page of the diary became his particular obsession. He spent hours studying each line, each annotation made in the margin, comparing them with his own knowledge of the mountain. Some landmarks he recognized, others seemed completely new, as if they existed in a parallel dimension of reality that was only now beginning to reveal itself to him. The heart of the mountain is not a place that can be found just with the eyes, Mrs. Rose explained one afternoon, while preparing a new type of tea that Mr. John had never tasted before. One needs to be guided there, and the guardians only show the way to those who are truly ready. The tea had a peculiar flavor, simultaneously sweet and bitter, and as he drank it, Mr. John felt his senses sharpen in an extraordinary way. The sounds of the forest became clearer, the colors more vibrant, and he could swear he heard distant music coming from the direction of the mountains. These are the sacred herbs of the ancients, said the healer, noticing his expression of surprise. They help open the eyes of the soul, to see beyond the veil of the common world. You'll need this clarity for your journey. It was during one of these afternoons of preparation that something extraordinary happened. While they were studying the map together, a hummingbird entered through the window of Mrs. Rose's house. But it wasn't a common hummingbird. Its feathers shone with impossible colors, changing hue with each movement, and its eyes carried the same ancient wisdom that Mr. John had seen in the Mustang's gaze. The tiny bird flew directly to the map, landing on a specific point that Mr. John had been trying to decipher. For a moment, its wings shone so intensely that they left a luminous mark on the paper, visible for only a few seconds before disappearing. "Another guardian," whispered Mrs. Rose, her voice trembling with emotion. "They are revealing themselves more and more. The time is coming, John." That night, as the full moon illuminated the mountains with its silver light, Mr. John had a vivid dream. He saw himself on top of the highest mountain, surrounded by mystical creatures, the mustang, the mountain lion, the hawk, the serpent, and many other animals that seemed made of light and shadow. They all looked at him expectantly, as if waiting for an important decision. Upon waking, he knew he was ready. His leg had healed completely, and with it, a new strength had grown within him. It wasn't just physical strength, but something deeper, a connection with the mountain that went beyond anything he had ever experienced before. "Tomorrow," he said to Mrs. Rose during breakfast. "I need to leave tomorrow." The old healer nodded, as if she had been expecting these words. She went to her room and returned with a small cloth bundle. "These are the sacred herbs," she explained. "You'll know when to use them. And take this too." She handed him a simple necklace made with a dark green stone tied to a leather cord. "This stone belonged to my great-grandmother," she continued. "She found it in the heart of the mountain on the day she was chosen as a guardian. Now it must pass to you." Mr. John held the necklace with reverence, feeling a slight pulse coming from the stone, as if it had a life of its own. As he placed it around his neck, a sensation of warmth spread through his body, and for a moment he had the impression that he could hear ancient voices whispering in the language of the mountain. "The journey won't be easy," warned Mrs. Rose, her eyes fixed on the mountains visible through the window. "The heart of the mountain protects itself from those who are not worthy. You will encounter challenges that will test not only your courage, but also your faith in the mysteries you now know." The sun had not yet risen when Mr. John departed. The morning mist covered the Clearwater's mountains like a cloak of mystery, and the cold air carried the aroma of the sacred herbs that Mrs. Rose had burned in a ritual of protection. The old. Logger adjusted the diary in his backpack, touched the green stone that hung from his neck, and began his journey. The map in the diary indicated a path that serpentined through the deepest valleys of the mountain, passing through places that Mr. John, even with all his experience, had never explored. As he advanced, he noticed that the forest around him changed subtly. The trees seemed older, more conscious, their branches moving in ways that couldn't be explained just by the wind. After a few hours of walking, he reached a clearing that wasn't on any common map. In the center, a formation of stones rose in a perfect circle, each rock covered with ancient symbols that seemed to glow under the light filtered through the treetops. Mr. John recognized some of the symbols from the drawings in Clara Sanders' diary. It was then that he heard the first call, a hawk's cry that didn't seem natural, followed by the distant roar of a mountain lion. The sounds came from different directions, as if the guardians were converging on that location. The air became denser, charged with an energy that made the stone on his neck pulse more intensely. Following his instinct, Mr. John prepared the tea from the sacred herbs that Mrs. Rose had given him. As the water boiled on a small fire, the sounds of the forest increased. The wind blew strange melodies among the trees, and shadows danced at the edge of the clearing, taking on shapes of creatures that existed between the material world and the mystical. As he drank the tea, his senses expanded in an extraordinary way. The colors became more vibrant, the sounds sharper, and he began to perceive presences around him. The mountain guardians approaching, first as shadows, then taking on more defined forms. The hawk landed on one of the stones in the circle, its feathers shining with impossible colors. The mountain lion emerged from the forest, as if made of light and shadow, its golden eyes fixed on Mr. John. The serpent slid silently through the grass, its skin reflecting patterns that told ancient stories. And then, majestic as the first time he had seen it, the Mustang entered the clearing. But this time it was different. In the daylight, Mr. John could clearly see the true nature of the animal. Its coat wasn't just chestnut. It seemed to contain all the colors of the mountain, changing tone with each movement. Its hooves didn't fully touch the ground, as if it existed partially in another plane of reality. The Mustang approached Mr. John and lowered its head in a gesture of recognition. In its deep eyes, the logger saw reflections of ancient memories, the first inhabitants of the mountain, the sacred pacts made between men and nature, the promises that had been forgotten with the passage of time. One by one, the other guardians approached, each bringing its own energy, its own wisdom. The air in the clearing became charged with power, and Mr. John felt the stone on his neck burn with an ancient and sacred energy. It was then that the visions began. Through the eyes of the guardians, he saw the past of the mountain, its formation in ancient eras, the first peoples who inhabited it, the sacred pacts that were made. He also saw the present, the threats that were approaching, the greed of men who saw only profit where there was sacred life. But the most impressive were the visions of the future, multiple possible paths that unfolded like branches of an ancient tree. In some, the mountain succumbed to destruction. In others, it survived, protected by those who still kept its mysteries in their hearts. The Mustang neighed, a sound that reverberated not only through the air but through time itself. The other guardians responded, each in its own voice, creating a supernatural harmony that made the earth tremble gently under Mr. John's feet. He understood then that he had been called not only to witness but to choose. As a new guardian, his role would be more than just protecting the mountain. He would need to become a bridge between worlds, someone who could keep alive the connection between the sacred and the profane, between the mystical and the mundane. When Mr. John returned to Rockville, 3 days had passed, although for him the experience in the heart of the mountain seemed to have lasted both an instant and an eternity. Mrs. Rose was waiting for him on her porch, as if she knew exactly when he would arrive. "You saw, didn't you?" she asked, noticing the change in his eyes. They were no longer just the eyes of an old logger. Now they carried the same mysterious depth that she had seen in the Mustang's gaze. "I saw more than words can express," he replied, sitting heavily in the chair next to the healer. The green stone on his neck still pulsed gently, now in tune with his own heart. In the days that followed, Mr. John began to truly understand his new role. He didn't abandon his work as a logger, but now he did it in a different way. Each tree that needed to be cut was chosen with even more care, always with the blessing of the mountain, always respecting the natural cycles of renewal. More importantly, he became a guardian of the stories, just as Clara Sanders had been before him. On full moon nights he began to receive visits, first from the children of the town, then from the adults, all attracted by the stories he told about the mysteries of the mountain. On his porch, with the ancient diary in his lap and the green stone glowing softly on his neck, he shared not only the old legends, but also his own experience with the guardians. He spoke about the Mustang that had saved him, about the stone circle in the heart of the mountain, about the importance of keeping alive the connection with the mysteries of the natural world. People listened, and something began to change in the town. The younger ones, who before only dreamed of leaving for big cities, began to look at the mountain with different eyes. The older ones, who had kept their own stories in silence for so long, began to share them too. Occasionally someone reported having seen a chestnut horse with a shining coat observing the town from the top of a hill, or having been guided back home by a hawk of impossible colors when they got lost in the woods. The mountain continued to reveal its mysteries, now through Mr. John and those who learned from him to see beyond the veil of the ordinary. On one of these storytelling nights, as the full moon bathed the mountain with its silver light, one of his youngest grandchildren pointed to the top of a nearby hill. There, silhouetted against the starry sky, was the Mustang. Mr. John smiled, feeling the green stone pulse on his neck, and continued his story. Because now he understood, the true magic wasn't just in the extraordinary events, but in the way the stories connected people, keeping alive the flame of ancient mysteries. Each shared story was like a planted seed, which would grow to protect the mountain in future generations. The Mustang remained on top of the hill until the end of the story, its majestic silhouette reminding everyone that the mountain guardians were never really far from those who kept their hearts open to the mysteries. End of story. Dear listeners, Mr. John's journey reminds us that there are more mysteries in our world than our eyes can see. If this story touched your heart, we invite you to join our community of storytellers. Subscribe to our channel to receive more narratives that explore the mysteries and enchantments of our land. Leave your like to help us keep the magic of ancient stories alive, and share in the comments your own experiences with the mysteries of nature. Every day we bring new stories that connect us with the ancestral wisdom of our land. Don't miss our next tales. They may reveal secrets that your heart has been seeking for a long time.